Good evening. Welcome to the Center of Architecture and Metropolitan Planning. I'm very happy to see that you came to watch a lecture by Phineas Harper. My name is Adela Vaculíková. I am an architecture historian and a writer in magazine ERCZ. I'm also a lecturer together with my colleague Matěj Beránek of a course called How to Write About a City, which takes place now this autumn in Camp. That is also one of the reasons why a critic, Phineas Harper, is today here with us, because it feels very relevant to talk about architecture and urban criticism right now. Phineas Harper is a contributor to The Guardian and Dizine, and one of the most affluent voices among the young generations of urban critics. They are also the co-founder of New Architecture Writers Program, supporting young critics of color. Today's event will have two parts. First, we will start by a lecture by Phineas Harper. Then it will be followed with a discussion in which you can take part in. It is simple, just by raising your hand, or for viewers who are watching us online, you can use slido.com and send us a question online. I am really looking forward to the lecture by Phineas, so I would like to welcome here at Camp in Prague, and please enjoy their lesson.
Thank you. Hopefully it's not a lesson. Hopefully it's more of an argument. I was talking to Stepan earlier, and he was like, oh yes, you know, the thing about Camp is it's so easy to attract all these kind of young, cool, trendy people. We struggle to engage older, less cool audiences. And I see that he was right. In London, we have the opposite problem. All the young people are out clubbing, and this room would be full of people in suits. But I'm glad that it's you instead. So, in 1825, the German lawyer Wilhelm Wundt built what was then the tallest rammed earth building in Europe, in Viborg, where it still stands today at 7 stories high. And he published a book about this, which he titled Complete Instructions to Build Extremely Cheap, Permanent, Warm and Fireproof Apartments from Bare Pounded Earth. What earth was for Wundt the material of the future? And I can see, oh, there's the quote, there we go. I can see why Wundt thought that earth was kind of a cool thing to think about as an architect or a city maker. For centuries, humans have made buildings and cities out of earth. This is the Emir of Zazzau's palace in Nigeria. It's an example of Hausa architecture, this sort of super expressive earth style. These are Hakka, vast earth and wood roundhouses in China. To give you a sense of scale, an entire village can live in each one of these. This is Shibam in Yemen, a sort of high-rise earth city. In fact, of all the urban UNESCO World Heritage Sites, 160 are made entirely or partially from earth. It's super low carbon, it's extremely abundant, it's got this sort of amazing sculptural quality to it, and it's easy to repair. This is the Great Mosque in Djenné, in Mali. It's covered in all these rods, which are kind of, you know, cool decoration, but they're also built-in scaffolding that allow local people to climb all over the facade and repair it as and when they need to. Similar thing in Cameroon. This cantinery structure is a Musgum house. Beautiful kind of geometric pattern is in fact a sort of 3-dimensional ladder, so that, again, you can climb all over it and repair the mud render when you need to. The strengths of earth architecture are the same for us as for Wundt, as for all of these examples. Load-bearing, low pollution, high thermal mass, abundant, easy to repair. So maybe it's no surprise that even contemporary architects are starting to pay attention to earth. The ochre walls of the Narbonne Antiquities Museum by Foster and Partners seem to be made of earth. Even the great Norman Foster has started using earth. Or is he? Though these walls seem to be earth, they are in fact a steel-reinforced earth composite with barely air less cement than regular concrete. Cement, of course, is one of the most polluting building materials in the world, accounting for 7% of global carbon emissions alone. Now, the term greenwashing was originally coined to call out hoteliers who would implore guests to reuse the same towels to save the planet while doing nothing substantive to address their polluting practices. It means the corporate tactic of pretending to be ecological. And I raise greenwashing because in all the coverage of Foster's very beautiful museum in France, I don't think I've seen any architecture critic yet discuss the ethical hypocrisy of faking your ecological credentials by building with fake earth-rammed walls. And it's a strange thing, you know, critics are flown out to these places, photographers are hired, magazines dedicate pages and pages of online and imprint coverage to them, and yet so often what I would think of as quite an important part of the story is missed out entirely. And it was the same with this building, Strata SE1, a 42-story tower built in 2010 in London. To my mind, it looks a little bit like a pubic hair grooming device, but that's not the point. The point is these three turbines. They were slated to produce 8% of the tower's electricity. And I found a video online of the director of WSP, the engineer who worked on this project and led the engineer who led this design. And he said, quote, "I was sitting next to the architect. He was sketching away," or maybe I have this up here. "I was sitting next to the architect. He was sketching away and just drew this huge sort of turbine at the top of the building. Without any analysis or anything like that, I just nodded. I'm sure we can make that work. But of course, the turbines don't work. The 15 steel fins hang completely motionless. In fact, even if they had worked, it would only produce about 2,300 euros worth of electricity a year, far less than a single offshore wind turbine produces in a day. Even if they had worked, they would essentially be fake, merely an eco-bling tiara of greenwashing on an otherwise incredibly ugly corporate tower." So, why am I telling you this story? What is the point of opening a lecture about the state of architectural criticism with these two buildings? I think it's because, as far as I know, I'm still the only architecture writer in the UK to have pointed out either of these hypocrisies. Now, I'm not the best architectural writer by a mile, and yet somehow it feels like these relatively straightforward and quite important aspects of these buildings don't get picked up on. That WSP video was on their website for 10 years before I wrote about that quote, after which they sensibly took it down. But why aren't those stories out there already? And what does that omission tell us about the state of urban criticism in the UK, but also beyond today? This talk is called Writing on the Wall: City Criticism in the 21st Century. I was asked to talk about kind of the purpose and the power of urban criticism today. Can we still use writing to shape the cityscape? Could we ever? And what is the point of urban critics? To challenge, celebrate, investigate this vast, sprawling real estate industry that we live in amid the rise of machine learning, social media, the internet at large, and so on. I've forgotten to start my timer, so I'm going to start it now and just hope that I don't run over. So, in 1994, was anybody here born in 1994? Probably not. Jerry's Guide to the World Wide Web catalogued the 10,000 or so websites that were registered at that time. And as he did so, Douglas Adams wrote an article for Wired magazine in which he said that trying to explain to publishers what the arrival of the internet would do to their business models was a bit like trying to explain to the Nile and the Congo what the arrival of the Atlantic Ocean would do to their currents. A few decades on, the number of registered websites now is well past 1 billion, Jerry's Guide to the World Wide Web changed its name to Yahoo, and the full weight of Adams's predictions is being felt by publishers everywhere, from The Times to Vogue to the Architecture Review where I used to work. They're all feeling the heat. Even now, online publications like Dezeen, ArcDaily, and Wikipedia are feeling the heat, as the rise of machine learning means audiences don't even need to click through to websites to get the information they're looking for, robbing them of advertising revenue and traffic. Sort of feels like quite a scary time, in a way. We seem to be lurching into an era where arts, writing, music, composition, even therapy are being outsourced to machines, while the media's ability to fund sustainable investigative journalism is evaporating. But there's a bit that I can't see on my notes, because it's below the screen, which says that regardless of that, I'm hoping this is going to be a hopeful lecture. My plan is to sort of show some things I'm really afraid about, and then to counterpoint them with some things I'm hopeful about, in the intention to reclaim the future of critical dialogue from what feels like it could be an impending car crash. So, my first fear, asset stripping. Urban criticism is quite different to other forms of criticism because it has almost no immediate impact. With theatre, restaurant criticism, to some extent film and music, certainly literature, a bad or a good review can be make or break for the economic models that those art forms rely on. If a show opens on Broadway and gets panned by the critics, audiences just won't go. In a similar way, if a new restaurant is given a glowing review by a famous food critic, it may get packed with customers for months to come off the strength of that one review. If I write a critical review of the new London headquarters of Google by Bjarke Ingels Group and Heatherwick Studio, who cares? The building's still been built, the architects have still got paid. My review, however critical, will make almost no difference to the people who go there, to the success of those architects' future careers, to the dominance of Google on internet service provision. So what was the point of writing about it in the first place? Well, there's two ways to answer that question, I think. One is, what if architecture criticism isn't about architecture? By that, what I mean is, what if the buildings are a hook? They're like the way into the story. But the real subject is the wider culture that has created those buildings. What if it's the society that surrounds the architecture that's really the focus rather than the building itself? In this sense, maybe architecture criticism is a form of social commentary, like a way of helping readers to understand and contextualize what life is like in the contemporary moment. It draws stories from architecture, but it doesn't necessarily have to affect architecture to have value. Let's apply that thought to the Google headquarters. Okay, what does the architecture tell us? We could think about this sort of tiered, zigzaggy facade. We could think about the stony cladding or the big windows. To me, the thing that is most striking about this building is just how fucking big it is. It's massive. It is longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall. It is one of the biggest offices in Europe. It's 330 meters long. Its roof garden is so expansive that it's sustaining wild foxes. No one knows how they got up there, but they are there, and they don't want to leave. And it's only the latest in a slew of monster projects commissioned by American tech behemoths. Completed in 2023, Edge East Side, now occupied by Amazon, one of the largest buildings in Berlin. Another campus by Big in the Bay Area is the size of 15 football pitches. The circumference of Apple's circular San Francisco HQ is over a mile long. Now, for me, the real architectural and social story here is about that scale. There's nothing new about big companies having big offices, but there's something about the record-setting, bombastic vastness of these mega projects that seems particular to the rapacious rise of oligarchical tech firms and their invariably male CEOs. And the specific architects that they pick to design these kind of corporate castles tell a story too. Of the buildings I've mentioned so far, 3 were designed by an architecture practice literally called BIG. Founded in Copenhagen, the Bjarke Ingels Group designed both those Google projects and the tower in Berlin. They're also working on an AI city in China and the Portuguese Silicon Valley. They are the architects du jour of the tech world elite. And the eponymous Bjarke Ingels' popularity amongst his tech bro clients is not surprising, given he shares so many of their attributes. He's a gifted hustler. He enjoyed commercial success from a very young age, just as many software entrepreneurs make their mark before 30. He's cultivated a persona drenched in this sort of youthful Californian informality. T-shirts, unkempt hair, photo shoots with his feet on the desk. He's worked hard to cultivate this sort of self-consciously playful juvenility, launching his first monograph in the style of a Frank Miller graphic novel and making architectural models out of Lego. I remember being a student and thinking this was all very refreshing. In the somehow po-faced world of serious architecture discourse, he was like this rakish disruptor, changing the way architects could look and sound in the same sort of way that Mark Zuckerberg changed the image of billionaires by wearing a zip-up hoodie. However, Bjarke's boyish brand is not always charming. Male architects are often accused of designing overly phallic buildings, but having christened his firm BIG, he registered the domain name big.dk. Now, I'm not a prude, but a penis joke in your company website? I find this juvenile at best, a bit creepy at worst. And maybe this is actually the way into talking about those huge projects commissioned by these wealthy tech bros. They're big gadgets for rich boys whose early rise to fame and fortune means they're still quite immature and they're still pursuing these sort of boyhood dreams, right? Most of us don't get to be billionaires by 30. Most of us have a life that is full of frustrating struggles, of false starts, of career hiccups, of relationships ending when we didn't want them to. And amid the grief of all that heartbreak and lost pipe dreams, we mature. And we realize that chasing grandiosity is actually a poor substitute for simpler lives lived among loving peers and great friends. The tech bros have never had to mature like the rest of us. They've never had to face day-to-day humdrum disappointment. Their stars rose early and they're still shining, and like a kind of cursed version of Peter Pan's Lost Boys, they are still chasing adolescent tastes. Largest, longest, tallest, roundest, and so on. I think in the end, Google's King's Cross HQ, like tech bro architecture at large, is a monument to men who never learned that bigger does not mean better. So that is one way to see architectural criticism. It's a lens through which we can look at something else important in society and better understand the dynamics of that other thing. The criticism is not necessarily about having an impact on the building, it's about having an impact on the reader, changing the way they think and understand the world around them. But there's another way to think about it too, and that is simply to slow down a little bit. Okay, our critique of that Google building is probably not going to keep Bjarke or Larry Page or whoever runs Google up at night. But that's fine. Architecture is slow, and architectural criticism can also be slow. Of course, one article isn't going to have that instant effect like a restaurant review might do. But sometimes ideas take time to unfold, and sometimes we as a society need to appreciate things that take time. I came here by sleeper train. It took quite a long time, but I enjoyed the journey and it was lower carbon, so why not? Slow things are sometimes better. Take, for example, The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs, a very celebrated book, standing up for organic, diverse, working-class communities against overbearing big developments in North America. Now, the time that Jacobs started her crusade, she was deeply uncool, very much out of vogue. This was not the prevailing wisdom of urban planning in her day. But gradually, over time, through subsequent writing, through other scholars picking up her work, through special issues of architecture magazines and reprints, she's kind of winning, right? Today, it's hard to think of many cities, at least in the kind of developed West, who aren't at least a little bit interested in Jane Jacobs' ideas. Many architects, urban planners, even mayors have read this book and take some of what it says to heart. If you think of the very popular concept of the 15-minute city, the idea that everybody should live within 15 minutes of all the things you might need to live a rich and happy life, that clearly owes something to Jacobs' advocacy of small, walkable neighborhoods packed with useful shops and businesses. So even if one piece of architectural writing or urban criticism cannot wield the power of a sassy restaurant review, in time, the wider industry of urban discourse can change attitudes. But what of that wider industry? So, when I started out as a kind of budding young writer, it seemed like a really exciting and expansive world. There were always magazines and newspapers. All the newspapers had architecture critics. It felt like there was a whole world. The BBC had a culture show which had a regular architecture segment on it. But there were many possibilities for me to pursue as I got older and more experienced. A decade later, feels like it's rather changed. Almost every newspaper has got rid of its architecture critic in the UK. I think there's 3 left that employ architecture writers regularly. Many of those design magazines have gone out of business. BBC no longer runs the culture show. It feels like a much weakened industry. Even the magazines that haven't gone out of business, like Icon, have gone from being a monthly magazine to twice a year, and they feel rather thin. Of course, there's some new players, Dezeen and so on, have arrived on the scene, but it's hard to deny that the landscape of published critical writing about urbanism, in the UK at least, is a shadow of its position just a few years ago. It's hard to imagine this increasingly emaciated sector will ever have the longevity to take up a cause like Jacobs' advocacy of livable cities into the future. Will they even be architecture critics in another 10 years' time? How can we continue to push ideas in an industry that is notoriously slow to change? Now, many people will argue that it's the internet that's killing the media. And of course, that's part of the picture, but I think there's another culprit. Ownership. So many of those magazines and newspapers that I just showed you are owned by venture capitalists, companies who buy companies, restructure them, and sell them on for a profit. But how do you sell something on for a profit in an industry that is declining? You asset strip it. So I'm going to tell you a little story. This used to be the office of the Architectural Review, where I had my first job and was deputy editor of. It used to have a pub. After the Second World War, the editorial team scoured bombed-out houses across London, and they amassed all this kind of furniture and architectural ornaments, and they built a remarkable interior in the basement of the townhouse where the magazine was based. They called it the Bride of Denmark. It was a private, subterranean pub beneath the editorial floors of the Architectural Review. And everyone who was anyone in the architecture world would want to visit the Bride of Denmark when they were in London. This is Frank Lloyd Wright holding court in the bride's snug. Now, it was small, but it had an immense atmosphere with many layers. Visitors were invited to sign their name with a diamond-tipped stylus on a mirror. All of this added to a rich kind of cultural tapestry of influences and feeling that obviously would shape and bleed into the work of the editorial team who were making this magazine just a few meters above it all. But the Bride is no more. When the publishing house was bought by the newspaper tycoon Robert Maxwell in the 80s, he sold the building and he's auctioned off the contents of the pub. All of that layer, all of that cultural armature, all that baggage was stripped away, flogged off. The mirror has been lost to some private collector somewhere. The most remarkable space in British architectural publishing history has evaporated, so this guy Maxwell can make a bit of money. This is what the office of the Architectural Review looks like today. AR is still a good magazine, but it's hard not to feel that something has been lost between this and this in the collective culture of architectural thinking, at least in the UK. And that pattern is still continuing. The current owners have realized that the Ayers archive is actually rather valuable. And so without consulting the editorial team, they sold it off, I think a few months ago, robbing that title of future potential revenue streams, allowing it to lose control of its own history. All those closed magazines that we looked at earlier might have been so much more able to sustain the challenges of the internet and AI if they still had control over their own assets and their own publishing history. It's no surprise, I think, that The Guardian is one of the very few newspapers in the UK left that still employs regular architecture writers, because it is owned by a not-for-profit trust that prevents it from being sold and from these sort of bodged sell-offs happening. So this is, I think, what we need to guard against. With an unthinking relationship to ownership, the media and critical discourse at large in our sector and in other sectors is susceptible to the whims of shareholders who might not care at all about the value of the conversations that those titles are inculcating. So we can talk all we like about the power of critical writing and the importance of urban dialogue, but if we're not also talking about the ownership structures that underpin that cultural language, we're not really talking about publishing today. So, if my first fear is that asset-stripping owners are robbing city criticism of the potential to make sustained interventions, the counterpoint to that fear is that by inventing new ownership models, we could not only remove the harmful influence of disinterested shareholders, but shore up more sustainable publishing at large. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples. This is Pete Apps's Substack. Pete is an amazing architectural journalist. He went day after day to the Grenfell Tower fire inquiry to report on how that was going. I'm just going to show you a photo of the fire very briefly. It's quite a harrowing image, but I'll flick off it in a moment. I just think it's important to remind ourselves how bad it was. Burned for 60 hours, 70 people died in a building specifically designed to prevent the spread of fire. Now, the reason that fire was not contained as it should have been was due to a bodged facade refurbishment that we know about, partly thanks to Pete's relentless reporting. No one is yet in prison for that criminal negligence, and most of the companies involved are still in business. In fact, the municipality that commissioned and oversaw that refurbishment is still the same political party in charge. So in some ways, nothing has changed. So Apps has started this Substack, and it's a way to sustain that investigative journalism that he's doing independently of whether or not editors at the big magazines are interested enough to commission him to write about it. And it seems to be working. He's building up a sort of sustainable audience there. Another also started on Substack, now sort of spinning out to in-print and events, is Victuals. Ostensibly, this is a food magazine, sort of food writing. But, in fact, is super interested in urbanism and migration and how the city itself produces food cultures in the UK and beyond. I think some of the best and most challenging urban writing we've had in the UK for years, or at least in recent years, has come out of Victuals. So our Substack and these kind of lightweight platforms like it side routes into urban criticism, which aren't so prone to the short-termist decision makers of big owners and can allow sort of punchier forms of architectural criticism that you might get than you might get from more institutional titles. Which brings me on to my second fear, the rise of insipidness. I don't know if you have this here, maybe it's slightly different, but in the UK, insipidness is on the march. And by insipidness, I mean a sort of shallow, a polite shallowness in how we talk as an industry. Sometimes it's veiled as professionalism, but it's really a way of people seeming to say something while actually saying nothing at all. It's the way people talk on LinkedIn, if you ever spend time on LinkedIn. They pat themselves on the back, they pat each other on the back. They do this sort of act about like, oh, aren't we sort of good and woke and interested in their issues, while doing nothing real to say or challenge meaningful change. This is a piece that came out a couple of days ago. I've anonymized the writer in case he's watching the live stream. I actually quite like him, but this is a good example of what I'm talking about. The subject, why big architecture firms need to champion small studios, is a good subject. Big architecture firms, at least in Britain, are gobbling up all the jobs. It's really hard to be a small architecture firm or landscape firm because you're just continuously outgunned by these big practices. Good topic. Does the writer at any point give an example of a big firm taking a job that really should have gone to a smaller firm? Does he interview a young practice and get a sense of like the personal harm that's being caused by this? Does he present any statistics about the scale of the problem? No, he doesn't do any of that. He doesn't actually even say that it is bad that big practices are gobbling up smaller work. The whole piece is this sort of earnest, polite, gentle suggestion that maybe big architecture firms need to champion small studios. You don't actually need to read the article. It's the headline does it all for you. The rest could just be ChatGPT. It has no bite. It is insipid. Why is this? Partly it's because of this. You know, the writer is clearly nervous about the collapse of the industry. Maybe his editors are too. Why they maybe don't want to take any risks by alienating potential advertisers or valuable future employers, and so they retreat to this kind of non-critical critical discourse where you sort of do all the signals of having a critical discourse without actually saying anything. But actually, employment instability is not just a problem for writing and publishing. It is much more widespread than that. It's for all city makers to think about. And actually, I think that if city making in general had more stable employment, maybe that would be a way to have a more critical discourse in architecture more widely, because how are any of us expected to put our livelihoods at risk when we need to pay the rent? So, a little story about this. In 1982, an architect kneels with a meter-long set square and a roll of drawings. He wears a skinny blue tie and a determined expression. Around him are a bin man, a dinner lady, a groundskeeper, a care worker, and other colleagues. This photograph was taken for a trade union poster campaigning against the sweeping privatization of British public services, including local authority architecture offices, shortly after the election of our former Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Shoulder to shoulder with tradespeople, this architect is not portrayed as an independent freelancer or a glamorous auteur. He is simply a worker standing in solidarity with fellow trade union members because his job is under threat. Now, times have changed. Today, almost no architects are members of trade unions in the UK. Maybe it's the same here, I don't know. But unionism in Britain is kind of an anathema to architects. And I think that weakens our critical discourse. How are we meant to have meaningful arguments as an industry if we're all nervous about our job security? So my second hope is that we find power in union, not necessarily a trade union, but some sort of industry body, ways of working together where we can draw strength from our collective power. As a sector, I think that all members of city making, in the widest possible sense, should be part of unionized labor of some kind. And this is a good story to back that up. In the 60s, there was this sort of massive boom of economic and population expansion in Australia, bringing urban development, but also threatening a lot of inner city green spaces. And at the time, the Builders Labourers Federation, the BLF, represented 90% of construction workers in the state of New South Wales. And BLF formalized social responsibility as part of their union ethos. They said that workers have the right to insist their labor is not used in harmful ways. And this concrete dedication to pursue social good spawned what were called the Green Bans, where basically BLF workers would say, we are not going to work on developments that threaten urban green space in New South Wales. So when developers announced plans to turn quite a rare bit of parkland in the working class suburb of Carlton into a factory, BLF members joined forces with local community and refused to build on the site. And because they were 90% of the workforce, the project had to be abandoned. I particularly like this placard, which I think says, cities are for people, not buildings, which, given it's being held by builders, feels like a real power move. The Green Bans are an example of city makers, construction workers in this case, using collective power, using the fact that they had 90% of their industry on board to force a better quality of public built environment. And in the UK, we do now have a union. It's very small, it's in its early days, but it is something. And I look forward to a time when more city makers everywhere see the value in finding like-minded peers, forming collective action groups, and being able to take the kind of stand that those Australian builders took to stop the degradation of their green spaces. What am I doing for time? Doing all right. Stopping degradation brings me to my final fear. Enshittification. So the science fiction writer Cory Doctorow came up with this term. It describes the way that basically all technology, particularly online software, gets worse over time. And the theory goes like this. First, companies make great products to attract loyal users. I remember when Twitter was new. It felt like this exciting new thing, and it was kind of great. Then they abused the users to prioritize acquiring loyal business customers. I remember when Twitter started to present sponsored posts above posts by people you actually followed and other sorts of things. Then they abused their business customers to prioritize their own profits. So even the advertisers are having a terrible time. But the company doesn't mind, because by that point it's scooping in so much revenue that nothing else matters. And we've seen this pattern again and again and again. Vimeo, YouTube, Dropbox, Google AdWords, Instagram, Netflix, Twitter, Spotify, all of them, I think, are significantly worse now than they were just a few years ago. And Doctorow's point is that this is not a coincidence. This is not the result of bad management decisions at these technology firms. This is an era of capitalism where long-term stability is not the goal. Investors are wanting massive speculative returns in the medium term, rather than an enduring product that will last for generations. So we shouldn't be surprised when the tools, the services, the media that we rely on seem to be making choices which are making them less good. And the relevance for critical discourse is obviously enormous. I don't think the problem with critical discourse is the fact that it's online. Even in this sort of slightly weird video-first era of TikTok, there are some amazing independent journalists finding a voice. So Joris Leshen, Norris Obajaku are using Instagram and TikTok to make these kind of short-form documentaries about interesting buildings around London and beyond that are engaging, they are sassy, they are popular. But how long will this kind of vibrant new style last within this enshittification economy? I don't think it'll last that long, because those platforms are going to get worse. They will start prioritizing advertising content and AI-generated slop rather than pushing audiences to Joris and Norris's stuff. Reliance on these platforms for critical discourse is doomed to fail because of the economic forces that those platforms are all built on. But here too, there is hope. Build a rich critical culture. So this is my final hope. It's sort of that the rise of AI might force us to have a counter-revolution. So teachers worry a lot about students writing essays using ChatGPT. And students worry a lot about teachers marking essays using ChatGPT. Maybe what we should realize is that the writing and marking of essays is actually massively overused in the education system, and no one is particularly happy about it, so everyone is jumping at the first opportunity to automate that kind of labor. Maybe educators should respond to the rise of ChatGPT not by banning phones or bringing back handwriting, as is often proposed in the UK, but by relying on essays less as an education tool. Maybe they should find more culturally rich forms of education that are tactile and haptic and collaborative and discourse-led, that involve play and making visits to places and drawing and learning through art and bodies and other ways than just assuming everything has to be channeled into an essay structure. And what would it mean to apply a sort of similar thought to critical writing or critical discourse? Is it time for a less text-based approach to urban thinking? And I say that as someone who makes money as a writer. You know, maybe we have at the moment, it seems like we have this. We have a kind of culture where criticism takes place bounded by and therefore reliant on platforms. And then surrounding the platforms, we have wider culture as kind of passive audiences that receive the criticism. But what would it mean to have a critical discourse like this, where criticism is woven into culture almost inextricably without such reliance on a specific set of platforms? So to conclude, I just want to flash through some other ways that I and past colleagues have tried to use a variety of cultural tactics to bring critical discourse about urbanism and architecture to life. Scale. Scale is powerful. This is Norman Foster selling out the 1,900-seat, okay, not completely selling out, there's some spare seats there, but mostly selling out the 1,900-seat Barbican concert hall. I can't actually remember much about what Norman said. I'm sure it was a fine lecture, but what was much more powerful was being in a room surrounded by my community. So many peers, so many friends, former colleagues. It felt special to do something at this scale, and the kind of cultural life of the bar afterwards was almost more interesting than the talk we'd all paid money to see. Scale can work the other way around as well. This is DKCM's Folk in a Box, a stage for one performer and one member of the audience. In this case, the idea was you go inside, it's completely dark, you think you're alone, and then it turns out there's someone in there with you, and they play you a song. And you can't see them, you can't hear any of the outside world, and that incredibly intimate experience is extremely powerful. It really makes your hair stand on end. When we did the Outer London Festival at the Architecture Foundation, where I used to be deputy director, we thought, okay, it's going to be mostly talks, but how about if we commission some Outer London bands? How about if we commission a set design that reflects some of the themes in the talks? Using set designs is I think, a fun way to bring any theme to life. When we did a classicism festival, we commissioned bars so that even the place where you went to get your coffee or your Prosecco somehow related to the topics that were being discussed. In this case, how can you make something that feels a bit classical out of extremely cheap materials that you could find in any DIY store? Or food. Food is an enormously accessible cultural format, widely underused in architecture land, I think. When we did this festival of architecture and art emerging from refugee camps, we invited people who made food with refugees to run a stall, talk about their work, added a layer to the day. Or changing what people see. I'm a huge fan of architectural walking tours in general, but working with Anna Gibb, the tour guide, who doesn't just take you on an interesting tour, but she'll make these big cartoons that bring to life some of the stories that she tells on those tours. When I curated the Oslo Architecture Triennale, the press launch was done blindfolded. And that was to deprive people of one of their senses so that we could make more of an audio piece of work that we had made to go with that press launch. Later in the day, those blindfolds became bandanas and worked as part of a costume strategy to split the journalists into different groups so we could do different activities with each group of journalists to give them a sense of the kind of program that we were putting together for the Triennale. Costume can also be a fun way to make something accessible to a different audience. This was very cheesy, but this is the architect Alex Hills, obviously dressed up as Christopher Wren, to help give a walking tour of one of Wren's great buildings in London, led by the tour guide William Palin. Bit of fun, but managed to enliven what was clearly a very soggy day and hopefully draw a few more people into that otherwise quite nerdy conversation about Wren's architecture. You can also change the perspective of the audience. Back at the Oslo Triennale, we worked with Rimini Protocol. We made a theatre show in which the audience moved around different parts of the theatre. Sometimes they lay down, sometimes they sat on this rubble mound, went up into the rigging of the theatre. By changing the physical position that an audience is experiencing, you can get them to consider issues in different ways. There's a lot of evidence that suggests if your body is doing something new, you are more able to build new neurological pathways in your brain as you age, and that is ultimately the point of any critical discourse, is to have new ideas. We did the same trick in the theatre, in the sort of exhibition that went with that theatre show. This was a little exhibition about tourism that, in this case, lifted you up off the floor, and then they talked to you a little bit about different forms of tourism. If you're doing a walking tour, this is one we did in Oslo again. We used audio headphones to convey the audio of the tour, but then also we could play people music and get them to dance and get them to think about, okay, how does the public space is the same, but it feels completely different when you're doing different things in it. It also feels different if you have different sensory understanding of it. So sometimes just blindfolding someone during an architecture walking tour gets them to think about, okay, what's the ground like? What can I hear? Gives them a slightly different perspective on exactly the same urbanism that they've walked through maybe many times before. And just a few final slides here. We think about buildings. We think about urbanism. We should know that space has power. And so if you're putting on an event about grief, as we were with this project, we rebuilt a sort of lost design by Adolf Loos in timber, and we put it on in the Highgate Cemetery, which is this like spectacular Gothic cemetery in North London. Why did we do that? Because we knew that that space would imbue the event with power, with a different kind of energy that would enable a different kind of conversation. And then we used that as a sort of stage set to have conversations about loss and mourning. Similarly, if you're doing a little program about the fun opportunity of inflatable architecture, why not build some inflatable architecture to go with it? This is Tom Randall Page's Air Draft, kind of floating inflatable theatre where we staged talks, but also some music performances, some opera happened in here. It's all about thinking about lightweight inflated architecture, but like taking every opportunity to make that a cultural experience that can that your body can feel rather than just your brain can process. I use a lot of stand-up comedy when I'm doing my, I run a series in London that's like debate, and they always open these debates with a clown or a comedian or a musical comedian because it changes the atmosphere in the room. It stops it from being an after-work event and it makes it a night at the theatre. And suddenly, if you're at a night at the theatre, you feel more comfortable, you can say ideas that you maybe wouldn't have felt comfortable saying in a different setting. It actually opens people's minds, it frees their tongues, they are able to speak ideas that they might not have done otherwise. Anyway, whatever formats you invent or explore, I think we should all be trying to find opportunities to learn and experiment with critical discourse. I think that we have to tackle these really heavy themes like unsafe buildings, like the climate crisis. We have to call out malpractice. We have to stand up to the powerful. But that doesn't mean we can't have fun while we're doing it. It doesn't mean we can't enjoy the experience of thinking in public and talking in public. I think we need, in fact, to enjoy the experience because we need to be able to call out greenwashing, fire crises, tech bro, juvenility, without clamming up from fear of reprisal all of the time. So making yourself and your audience comfortable in your critical discourse is really important. And that's a way that we can not just champion these causes over time, but we can affect real change, like our friends at the Union did in Australia. So whatever formats you create in response to this talk or separately, I think you should probably have fun while you're doing it. And I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the talk, Finn. So we can move to the discussion.
Great. Do you want me to sit down?
Yes, please.
Okay.
If you don't want to, then you can. But I only wanted to tell you that Birke Ingels also had a lecture here.
Yeah, I heard. Maybe he's watching the live stream. Change your website.
So we ask Birke Engels to send some questions through Slido. You can also use it to send me questions. I can ask the question and think an answer. If you can ask by raising your hand, that is also an option. Just do that and someone will come and give you a microphone.
You don't have to, you could also argue. Yeah. There's one.
Great.
What is your opinion on Björk Engel's new project in Prague of Prague Philharmonics?
Oh, I haven't looked at it, I'm afraid.
Oh.
I only heard about it today. It's probably bad. They're a funny firm, aren't they? I remember feeling like, wow, these guys can really communicate when I was young, and now I feel like I've matured. But I can see how what they are good at is making a stupid idea sound sensible. Like, we've taken this and we've wrapped it over here, and now we've punched that through, and these are the roads. And you're like, uh-huh. I sort of, but I guess what the productive thing that we could learn from that office is that communication is really important, and being able to tell a story is really important, and being able to present yourself is really important. He's an attractive guy, or he was when he was younger, and he speaks well, and he was very good at using 3D animations to be like, look, I'm doing this thing, and that excited people and drew people in. So I don't begrudge him the success in a sense. I think there's stuff we can learn from it, but hopefully we can produce some more mature, sophisticated, ecological architecture at the end of it. But I'll look the project up.
Okay. Next question.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. You mentioned the Architecture Union organization. Was that in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, the BSF is Australian, but the new union I mentioned with the flags, that's in the UK. Yeah.
Yeah. May you elaborate on how that organization functions, sort of? Because I suppose there's a more official, professional, collective body or organization as well in England, and is this Architecture Union somehow in collaboration with this more official body, and does it have some real leverages? Sort of, not just
Okay. So they're called the Section of Architecture Workers. They're quite new. You might have noticed most people in that photo are fairly young, in their 20s and 30s. I think they started maybe 8 years ago, and they've been growing gradually ever since. They're not affiliated to the Royal Institute of British Architects, which is the sort of main professional body in the UK. But the RIBA is not a union, and it will never and has never fought for the working conditions of architectural workers to improve. Some people say it's like a union for managers, like it's sort of for owners of companies more than it is for the workers at companies. And so there is, there was and still is, a sort of big gap for an organization that can support workers, and not just architects actually, but the people who clean the office, the people who answer the phones, the people who write the funding bids and so on, all architectural workers. And I think it's slow progress. They still only got a few hundred members, but they've now joined Unite, which is a much, much bigger trade union that represents all sorts of sectors. So hopefully that will help them to kind of grow and become more effective in their work. But even with a small number of members, they have helped workers who've experienced employment disputes win hundreds of thousands of pounds collectively in compensation for being wrongfully dismissed or fired when you've taken maternity leave or something, and they get rid of your job while you're away. So even as a small organization, they're making quite a big impact. Does that answer the question? Okay. Yeah, they're trying to collaborate with with Unite. Unite's the big parent body that represents lots of different kinds of construction workers as well as architects. So they're trying to build bridges with the structural engineers, the builders, the M&E guys, and so on. It's very slow, as you can imagine, but they're certainly trying to like act in collaboration with other types of construction worker. I think it's good. Are you going to pick them, or are they going to?
Hi. So I wanted to ask you a question that starts from the thing you said about using platforms to like reach wider audiences. I agree with you on that point, but it raises a question for me as to how like reach wide audiences and not create like an echo chamber of like critics just talking and writing about stuff that only like the architecture firms read and stuff like that. So how to like make it like a wide discussion so that like normal people would also have like, you know, would get to read that material and like have discussions and stuff like that.
Yeah, I used to run a charity called Open City, which one of the things it does is administer the Open House Worldwide network. So there's Open House Prague, Open House London, Open House New York, and so on. And these are all kind of architecture festivals, but they are so popular with ordinary people who have no architectural background at all. Or at least that was the case in London. And that's the reason I went to work at that organization, was because it was like, oh wow, this is a way to bring people in from all backgrounds into dialogue about city making, which is a sort of omnipresent challenge for critics, institutions, curators, whatever. And one of the things I think, one of the lessons you can learn from the success of the open house model is you go where the audiences are. You know, it's good to bring people to an institution. That's a valuable thing to do, but it's also valuable to go to them. And what we could do with Open House was to open buildings all over the city. So people didn't have to travel very far. They could just be like, oh, there's one next door. Let's go have a look at that. And even if they had kind of not a particularly long or very in-depth conversation about that one building, that was still a start. It was a way into thinking about the city, thinking about how things could be better or why things are the way they are. So yeah, there's lots of ways of like broadening out, avoiding that trap of being an echo chamber. Also, I think echo chambers are still good. Like we still need some echo chambers. It is good to preach to the choir. That's why you're in the choir. You know, it's like important to build a culture around your community. It is also important to reach out beyond your community. And I think sometimes we're a bit mean about people who like maintain the culture of their community. That's also valuable work. But yeah, in terms of reaching out, it's go where the people are. Use the formats that they're already interested in. Commission the people that they're already interested in. That would be my tip.
Thank you.
Okay, sim tady.
Some great scarves today.
I actually have a lot of questions, but I will ask for the beginning just one. I'm a journalist myself, writing on architecture for an online magazine called ER.cz with Adela. We are actually, by the way, an independently owned small alternative magazine, which we have actually we are owned by two guys who love architecture, no capitalists. But which means also that we constantly struggle with the money and so on. So, but the question is different. I see that we are talking about the critical discourse, but I see that the people love architecture. They love to read about it. They love to see the pictures, but they really like it as kind of feel-good content. They love to see nice huts on the lake or beautiful interiors of beautiful flats and so on.
Yeah.
And it attracts way more people to read and to interact than the critical stuff. Do you have this experience too? Or can you
Yeah, of course. People like nice things. I like nice things. But I guess I'd try and see that as an opportunity as well as a challenge. It's like, okay, you like interior refurbishments. Well, did you know that actually refurbishment is one of the most important things that we need to do to fight the climate crisis, because knocking buildings down and building them from scratch is so polluting? Can we channel your natural interest in nice refurbishments into maybe becoming more active in a campaign to save a community that's about to lose its social housing estate? Can we channel your interest in this sort of these pretty tiles into a conversation about the decline of manufacturing in this country? So I think there's always, even if people have this sort of slightly facile, bland, feel-good instinct, there's still ways that you can kind of use that and take that and like push it in a certain direction. Well, not quite sure what you mean by that, but just like, people aren't wrong to like nice things. The challenge for us as curators or critics or anyone is to take that interest that is bubbling up organically and to do something that's like a little bit more provocative, a little bit more pushy with it. Yeah, I think there's always ways, but also like it might take a while. It might take a while for someone to. It's like whenever you ask someone, "Oh, how did you become interested in architecture?" They're not like, "Well, I was deeply concerned about the climate crisis, and I took a look at the statistics, and I thought, gosh, I've got to go into architecture." They're always like, "I went to see a really cool church with my mum when I was 8, and I thought, wow, this is cool. Maybe I could be an architect." It's always the way into someone's life choices like that is through something quite shallow but quite inspiring at the same time. So I think we have those opportunities, and we should use them.
I think I can say that you are not like a classical architecture critic. As we talked with each other earlier, you mentioned that both for The Guardian and The Zine, you write opinion pieces. Is it a format you resonate with the most, or?
Yeah, so but also it's what's available. You know, like Ollie's already got the job as the Guardian architecture critic, so
no more
I can't have it.
places.
So, it's partly about like using the opportunities you can find to do the best that you can, rather than like imagining, oh, there's only one sort of vehicle for me as a professional to sort of make change with. You know, all of us are sort of constrained in some ways, but we also have opportunities in other ways. And so what I'm trying to do is use the opportunities that I have within the constraints that I have to do good work, I guess. If I was more of a conventional architecture critic, I'd be trying to use that format, that form of writing to push similar agendas, but I'd have to use a different tone of voice. I'd have to write in a different way. I'd probably have to spend much more time traveling around, looking at buildings in person. So yeah, I think I'm sure everybody, especially anyone who works in the built environment, is very familiar with constraints. But there's always opportunities as well, I think.
Okay. You have a lot of questions, Finn. That doesn't happen often.
I'll try and answer faster.
Můžu mluvit? Okay. Can I?
Hi.
Hi. I reread the review of the Biennale you wrote earlier this year in May. So you used the term tech bros there in the title. And I very much liked the structure of your lecture, how you always gave the fear and then the hope, and you ended with the hope. But quite honestly, we do witness something like a kind of reactionary current in architecture, and it's clearly displayed in the environment of this year's Venice Biennale. What's your view of the future in this sense? What's the strategy to maybe counter it without contributing to some sharp divisions? Are you more hopeful or less so?
So it's for anyone who isn't familiar with the Venice Architecture Biennale, it's this massive festival that happens every 2 years in Venice. This year was curated by an MIT guy called Carlo Ratti, who had kind of packed this massive exhibition hall with technology projects. It was all like robotic arms, robotic dogs, robotic arms on robotic dogs. And it felt bad. It felt really bad. It felt like a vision of architecture that was not particularly interested in people, actually. That was like trying to solve problems that didn't really need to be solved with machines. They even had, they'd asked all the contributors to send texts about their various exhibits, and then they'd used machine learning to summarize all of those texts using AI. And all the contributors were really unhappy about this, because they're like, I would have summarized it for you. Why did you have to feed that into a large language model? So it was quite depressing and stressful, and so that's what I was trying to convey in that article, was this sort of feeling of like overwhelmed by techno gibberish. But hopefully in the second half of the article, there was also a point where you move out of Carlo Ratti's domain into the national pavilions that are also in Venice and see that he's not the mainstream. All right, he's part of this sort of like bubbling tech world who have loads of money and power right now. But that's not where most architects in the world are at. A lot of people are thinking really carefully, quietly about how do we insulate buildings better? How do we use more natural materials? How do we like learn more from indigenous communities? How do we respond to climate breakdown by using more biomaterial? Like all really good kind of wholesome themes. So yes, it's true that we live in a sort of, I am scared about the influence that Elon Musk has over American democracy at the moment. But I'm also deeply inspired by the kind of hemp house that my friend is making. And when I graduated, sustainability wasn't cool. Like no one was talking about embodied carbon. Now loads of people are. Now like government policy is starting to reflect this stuff. It's not moving fast enough. There's still too many people excited by robot dogs. But it does feel like the best architects, the most exciting architects for me, are thinking really carefully and holistically about not just form, but like the whole supply chain of how a building is made and its responsibility to the planet and the society that it's part of. So I think it's just like you have to temper your fear and your frustration by reminding yourself of all this great stuff, and like maybe spend a bit more time looking at all of that lovely stuff rather than like tearing your hair out because Elon Musk said something stupid or something. I think that would help. Like focus on the really good people and lift them up. And that's part of being a critic, is not just slagging off the bad stuff, but like championing the good stuff.
Can we give the microphone here, maybe? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Hi, I'm glad to see you in Prague, and I wanted to thank anyone who invited you, actually. But my question is, and sorry, I missed the beginning of your presentation, so
it's really good.
I might be lucky that I will watch it from the recording, but maybe I was lucky to see the optimistic ending and.
Sorry.
But I was wondering, like, first, I would agree that we like criticism in the, let's say, architecture profession in general. And then you showed some tools or ways how to engage people with critical discourse. But for me, it felt like, and maybe you would argue with me, but it felt that those programs or those tools you showed were to engage kind of general public or like people, and it felt that these or like people or general public are already interested in architecture and its criticisms or in critical point of view on the way how we shape the built environment or public spaces. And I think that Camp, for example, is one of the places which is trying to do this, to work with the public. But I think it's that the profession itself or the architect's professionalists who are egoistic and who are not open to sincere criticism. And I didn't feel like that these are the tools how you reach them actually. Or maybe prove me wrong. But so the question is, when you talk about the critical discourse, whether you have in mind actually the architects or people in general?
I mostly have in mind non-professionals because that's my big interest. That's what most of my experience is in. If I flash back a bit, like this. Sorry. Yeah, these guys. These are all architects. They're all professionals. This is the Architecture Foundation putting on an event at the Barbican, which is itself is a kind of cultural center very much associated with architecture. And sure enough, it's a famous architect on stage, and it's a format that is like familiar to built environment professionals. I think this is fine. This is a good way to do discussion. I'm just saying that there are other ways that can make people think and maybe make people open to new ideas and forming new ideas that are worth trying as well. The other point I wanted to make is about new architecture writers, which is something that was mentioned in the introduction. I think when I was a deputy editor at the Architecture Review, I and my other fellow editors realized that all the writers we knew were white. There was like 2 writers we knew of color. And that was it. And we were like, God, how embarrassing. We're meant to be an international magazine, and we're like scrabbling around to find writers who are black or brown. And so me and a historian called Tom Wilkinson set up the New Architecture Writers Program, which is a free short course for writers of color. And it only has like 7 or 8 members per cycle, but we're now in our 7th cycle. So we've produced quite a lot of graduates, and it's completely changed the landscape of architectural and design publishing in the UK. So many of our members have gone on to quite substantial jobs at the RIBA Journal, at Dezeen. The Spectator's architecture critic is now someone who came through this program. Now, partly the reason for that is like it would be good if we had a more diverse pool of architecture writers in the UK. But it is also about how you engage readers, because readers, whether you like it or not, are more likely to engage with work produced by people who look and sound a bit like them. So if you have a more diverse pool of people creating material and creating critical discourse, you will reach a more diverse audience inherently. And we were, I think it's sort of working. Like you see this reflected in the statistics that like gradually more people of color are coming into not just architecture, but architectural writing and architectural discourse over time. And then they're setting up their own projects and blah, blah, blah. So I think the question of engagement is, it's a good question. It's an important question, but like there are so many different ways to do it. And I think what I'd try to encourage people to avoid is a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. Like there is no magic formula that will reach everyone in the industry, all different backgrounds, and the general public, and their mum. You have to kind of do lots of different formats to reach different audiences in different ways, and hopefully if you do all of it, you will have somehow created a really rich cultural approach to critical debate.
I have a question from Slido for you, Fen.
Whoa.
You studied architecture, but you became an architecture critic. Have you ever regretted not being an architect?
No. Have you seen how little architects get paid? Yeah, of course. Like I love design. Design is great. I have immense respect and admiration for people who've sort of stuck with it. I also make sculpture, and I think that's partly a way to kind of keep one foot in the world of kind of making and composing. No, hopefully life's too short to have too many regrets. You have to just got to feel like, this is where I am. I'm going to make the best of it.
Okay, great. Another one. Do you think architecture is capable of genuine empathy?
Well, architecture is not really a thing. Architects are, yeah. I mean, I dated an architect for 4 years, and she was like immensely empathetic, really kind, brilliant person. So yes, of course, it's possible for architects to be empathic. I would say that maybe the economic model of development struggles to be empathetic, or at least struggles to empathize with everybody fairly. But I think that's one of the best things about architecture, is the way that it can kind of hold you as a person or as a community and like make you feel good.
Great. I'm also supposed to tell you that you have a lovely skirt.
Thank you. It's from eBay.
Okay, do we have more questions from the audience? Mm-hmm.
Who are you pointing at?
I'm pointing to the, yes, to the man.
Hi, I'm Luke, and I would like to ask you to expand upon your point about earthwork and earth in architecture and in buildings, because from what I heard, the only good point that you have mentioned is that it has lower carbon emissions, and if I were to bring up a counterpoint, then concrete is better. Like, you can build anything out of it. So
Concrete's a terrible material. Think about how you make concrete, right? First, you mine limestone. Then you smash that limestone. Then you fire it in a kiln to well over 1,000 degrees to make clinker. Then you smash that clinker. You take it to a cement factory where you mix it with water and more stone that you've smashed. Then you take it to a site and you pour it into a massive mold that you throw away. This whole thing takes ages, uses a colossal amount of energy, comes out as a liquid, so you have to build disposable formwork to use it. Like, Earth's not perfect, but there's so many better alternatives than concrete. Limestone is quite good, actually, just as it comes out of the ground, before you've done all of that smashing process. There's some guys who just today have built what they call a stone demonstrator, and it's a kind of 4-story stone structure using load-bearing stone, spanning stone, stone bricks. It's really demonstrating how stone can be used in lots of different ways that it isn't currently. That is way, way lower carbon than it would have been if it was made with concrete.
But I would counter-argue that there are so many buildings and builds that can't be built without a material that is that strong and that light. And how would you go about replacing it, for example, in kilometer-long bridges and etc.?
Well, I mean, talk to some stone engineers, because they will show you that it is completely possible to replace the vast majority of concrete with stone or with timber or with other materials that are much lower carbon. The opportunity of Earth is not that we should build everything out of Earth. It's that we should build a lot more with Earth, because it is so abundant, it naturally insulates, it's easy to repair, and so on and so on. And it's like that with a lot of materials. It's not like there is one magic material that will solve all of our problems, but we should be using a lot more of the sorts of things that we're currently ignoring or dismissing or not using to the fullest example. And it depends on your climate, it depends on kind of local material flows and so on. But there's so many material opportunities that we're just missing, because we always default to this small set of highly processed, high carbon materials like steel, like concrete, and like brick. It's like we're only eating 3 types of meal. And we're just being like, yeah, I'm just going to have my bowl of cereal, my sandwich, and then my roast duck. And I will only eat those 3 things because that's what I'm familiar with. And you're like ignoring this enormous set of other options that are not only lower carbon, but also kind of amazing, very sculptural, very beautiful, like give you a different smell, different sound, different, like we're just cutting out so much potential architectural richness by this sort of dogmatic use of like, I'm gonna make it out of concrete. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. I was thinking a lot about what you were saying about how there's this kind of like disingenuous move towards using earth materials for, like in your introduction,
Yeah,
how,
greenwashing.
yes, well, greenwashing, but I was really struck by the, mainly like using like wood, but instead it's concrete. And it made me think a lot about how where I grew up, I've noticed that over the years, the streets have changed with like restaurants having fake flowers and kind of fake green walls, which I think is really interesting because in a way it almost normalizes living in a city and having access to green space in a way, but also at the same time, it is a kind of greenwashing. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about kind of straddling both of these and how, on one hand, while it might be good to get people kind of thinking in cities about how having access to green space can be a reality and can be okay and can be possible, how do we make sure that people don't get stuck in that and then actually deliver on these green promises and incorporate meaningful green spaces?
Yeah, so you're sort of seeing like fake plants as like a gateway drug. It's like,
Yes. And so how
today
do we,
I will have a fake plant, tomorrow I will have a park.
but yeah, like how can we make sure that it doesn't, it's not just, it doesn't stay with the fake plants?
Yeah. Yes, it's interesting because like people have to fight so hard to, I don't know, get rid of one parking space and turn it into like a pocket park or some sustainable urban drainage that there is a real risk that once you've done that, everyone's just so exhausted from the fight that they're like, let's never talk about that again. We're just going to leave it as a pocket park. I don't know. I'm sort of, politically, I'm kind of quite revolutionary, and I'd sort of say I really don't trust people who take a small win as enough. I'm always saying, yeah, but what about some more? What about bigger change? But I think that the liberals have a point in that small change is better than no change, and maybe it can be a stepping stone. Maybe even a fake plant can be a kind of step towards more urban greenery, if it, as you say, if it normalizes that. But no, I think I'd be cautious, and I think you see this a lot on LinkedIn of this sort of people sort of celebrating the smallest of wins and satisfying themselves that that's enough. And part of the role of the critic is maybe to call that out and say, you know, this is not actually meaningful change. This is a good start, but that is sort of it. And I think that is greenwashing, you know, when you're sort of saying, we've made it out of a bit of earth, will that do? You're like, no, you could have, you know, Foster & Partners are an amazing firm. They're huge. They've got loads of incredible designers. They could have done better. And that's why it's frustrating to me that there weren't more critics pushing them. All right, if that was like some big, like a normal corporate without the skill and the experience of Foster's, maybe I could have seen that as good. But they're such talented designers. They could and should have been held to a higher standard. So it's partly about like recognizing where people are at, and you know what's the best that you could have hoped from that situation. I think that's part of it.
Hi, I'm sorry. Just first of all, thank you for the talk. It was brilliant. You know, you filled me with so much energy. It was really good. I won't be able to sleep tonight. I just wanted to ask you two questions. First one is, you talked about food and architecture, and you know, I just was curious about what did you actually meant by it. And the other question, as journalist, what type of media or news do you read, like yourself? Like, how do you keep yourself in touch?
Yeah, well, it's sort of the same answer. Jonathan Nunn is an amazing writer based in the UK. He set up that Vittles Substack that I mentioned. He's a food writer, but he has a deep interest in city making. And I guess what I mean by food and architecture being linked is that you can't make certain types of food in certain buildings. Like there's an inherent link between the design of a kitchen and even the design of a neighborhood and the kind of food culture that that neighborhood or that household can create. So if you're someone who's interested in food, like really interested, not just interested in like going to posh restaurants, you quite quickly have to become an urbanist. You quite quickly have to think about like, what is the supply chain that's bringing ingredients into my city? Where are those ingredients being prepared and in what manner are they being prepared? So that's why I think it's linked. And I guess Jonathan would argue that restaurant criticism and architecture criticism are comparable because they're both spatial. You know, it is a different thing to have the same meal in a different building. Like it's part of your experience of eating is the place where you're having the meal, which is slightly different to like a cinema. Well, you know, watching the film is kind of the same in any cinema, and like reading a book is kind of the same whether you're reading it on a beach or on a train or whatever. Whereas food, like, it's a very bodily thing to eat. And in terms of like what I personally, I think we should all actually be subscribing to some more stuff. One of the reasons all these magazines are collapsing is very few people subscribe to them anymore. And so I subscribe to, I think, 4 magazines currently. I don't always read all of them. In fact, I rarely read all of them. But I think it's important to support them and important to engage with them. You don't have to read everything in every article. Like, you don't have to look at every painting in a gallery to have got something out of going to that gallery. So one of them is that food magazine, Vittles. One of them is The Private Eye, which is a long-standing sort of investigative journalism and satire magazine in the UK. One of them is The Architectural Review, the magazine that I used to work for, and one of them is The Fence, which is a very young publication. It's only on like issue 22 or something. Just sort of long-form deep dives into the weird bits of London and the sort of surroundings of London. So it's hopefully a good spread. And hopefully is like doing my bit to like support a bit of independent journalism. So if you're someone in this room who doesn't subscribe to anything currently, I would encourage you to go home and subscribe to at least one thing. It could just be someone's Substack that costs you £4 €4 a month or whatever. It doesn't have to be the Financial Times, right? It can be something small and light and cheap, but you should be supporting something.
Thank you.
Okay, lady in a white sweater, please.
How many do we have time for?
I'm allowing 3 more questions.
3 more, okay.
Okay, sorry.
Do we do them all at once and then I can answer them all? No? Okay, go on.
1, 2.
First of all, I'm not a lady, but...
Sorry.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. I was wondering to ask you about, you said in your lecture that architecture criticism is like, have a little no influence on eventual design of building, but I would argue that it's not the case because you have some petitions or some general public that if they do not like the building, it won't be built. Like, so we have some examples here in Prague, which is frankly what it be here. Like, we have a petitions and it got overthrown and redesigned. And even on the late stages of building, you can make some slightly changes in designs that will be more appealing to public via architectural criticism, which is quite important for us.
You're completely right. I guess I was thinking of once a building has been built, it doesn't really matter what you say about it. But you're quite right that in the run-up to the building, there is more of an opportunity for critics to intervene. And sometimes that intervention is, don't build that building. My writing is often about don't demolish that building. It's about heritage. I'm a trustee of the 20th Century Society. My sister's housing estate is under threat of demolition, as are lots of other social housing estates in the UK. So I'm often advocating against a piece of architecture because I want to save an existing piece of architecture. It still feels like a small voice in the kind of the scale of these projects. But you're quite right that in the kind of development stages and the planning stages, there's more of an opportunity for critical public discourse to have a immediate or like significant impact. Good point. Two more?
Two more.
Okay.
Hi. When you were presenting about the big tech companies, my thoughts were that these companies in the future will not stop wanting to make more money. And so my question would be, if the CEO of some company would come to you and tell you that they want to build a new headquarters and they will build it because they have the money, but they would also want to reduce the criticism they get from you, what would they have to do differently? Thank you.
It seems like quite a far-fetched scenario. But yeah, of course it is possible to build well. Like, of course it is possible. So I would advise them the same thing that I'd advise anybody who's trying to build a building, of like, well, you need to choose really good architects, and you need to think really carefully about the communities that surround the context that you're building, and you need to think about the planet. And I'd maybe point them in the direction of some projects that I think are really good. The Luma, Atelier Luma thing that BC, the Belgians, BC Architects, Materials and Studies, and Assemble just did in Arles, in the south of France, is a really good example. It's a refurbished train station. They sourced every single material from within a sort of 15-kilometer radius. A lot of those materials are super low carbon or bio-based. So like, it is totally possible to build even really big things really well if you do it carefully and work with excellent designers. So the point about the tech bros is I think that they sort of haven't grown up and they're still like kind of little kids, and so they like these, what if it was a massive circle? Yeah, cool. Which is that's not how you do architecture. Maybe that's how Bjarke does architecture, but I think there are better, more mature, more interesting, more careful ways to do architecture.
Last question, please.
It's sassy. Yeah, he's...
Okay.
Hello. I'm a little bit nervous to speak publicly in English, so hold fingers. And I started to know about you by the Peter Barber's Instagram. He was reposting something one and a half year ago, and it's really great to see you here in real time and hear your thoughts. Just thanks to Mike Zuckerberg. But by the way, I would like to ask you about your thoughts about English school system in the context of architecture, because in my country, in Czech Republic, when I've been in school, I used to be in school, it was impossible to get something about architecture, get any opinion. For example, I only understand that on the vocabulary in English class, there was like this, your dream is to live in the house in the suburbs and drive to the city by the car, and that's the vision of the life, how to be successful. So maybe it starts from the educational system, and you spoke about the culture, which is secondary system of education. So maybe that's the way. And you spoke about the newspapers and magazines, which they don't write a lot about architecture. Maybe it's about the demand of people. Maybe I'm looking at the simple way, but it's just not about the owners, but maybe it's about the demand of the people, which starts maybe from the educational system. So that's
yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that education is I think there's a thing that I'm not accusing you of doing this, but there's some people who will say, we need to think about the next generation. Let's make the change in schools. And that lets them off the hook from making any changes to their company or their strategy. So there's always a kind of inherent danger in thinking too much about, well, what are the children learning, rather than thinking, well, what are we doing? You know, what's our responsibility what's our responsibility here? But having said that, you know, when I ran Open City, we did loads of work with children from working class communities all over London. And many of them had never had any conversations with anyone about cities or city making, or like how London is and why London is the way it is and how London might change in the future. And so these kids were getting to like be young teenagers, and our workshops that we were running with them was the first time that they'd had a conversation about city making. And I just thought, how weird is that? Like, what a missed opportunity. The city is such a like stimulating topic. And when we did introduce it with these young people, they loved it, and they'd like get really excited, and they'd make these amazing models and have kind of quite sophisticated ideas about the future of their neighborhoods. So I think there's absolutely way, way more that schools could be doing to kind of use architecture and urbanism as teaching tools, and to teach about architecture and urbanism. And it sounds like it's sort of similar here to the UK, that's not really happening yet. There's sort of some good, you know, finally there's some architects on the art curriculum. So if you do GCSE art, which is like the 16-year-olds do GCSEs in the UK, you might learn about some architects, but that's kind of it. So slow progress. And I guess the opportunity for all of us as city makers then is to, alongside making change in our practice, to think, well, you know, could I do workshops for my local school? Could CAMP have like a bigger education program that's going to schools in Prague and so on? So yeah, like we can help. It's no good just sort of complaining to teachers. I think we can do a little bit of work to kind of bring those topics into classrooms as well. I didn't go to school until I was 16 though, so I'm not the best person to talk to about this.
Okay, that was Phineas Harper. Thank you very much for your lecture, and thank you all for all the questions. It was great, and see you next time. Bye.
Thanks.